She was sitting in a hospital room, holding the hand of the one person who had always known how to reach her, and for the first time in 67 years, she had nowhere else to go. Not into the past she had spent decades repainting in her mind. Not into the future she had long used as a hiding place. She was just there. Fully, achingly, terrifyingly there. And in that moment, with the beeping of machines and the soft hum of fluorescent lights above her, Margaret realized she had never actually been present for her own life. Not once. Not really. That is the kind of realization that does not arrive quietly. It does not tap you on the shoulder and whisper gently. It comes like a wave that has been building for decades, and when it finally breaks, it takes everything with it. Margaret had been a schoolteacher for 39 years. She had raised 2 children, buried a husband, attended birthday parties and graduations and Sunday dinners. She had shown up for every obligation that life placed in front of her. But showing up and being present are 2 entirely different things, and this is a distinction that millions of people never come to understand until it is almost too late. The story of Margaret is not unique. It is, in fact, the story of a staggering number of people walking the earth right now. Research from Harvard University found that the human mind wanders nearly 47% of the time. Nearly half of every waking hour, people are somewhere other than the moment they are actually living in. They are replaying conversations that happened years ago, rehearsing arguments that have not yet occurred, grieving losses they cannot release, and constructing elaborate fantasies of lives they believe would have made them happy. All the while, the actual life they are living passes by like scenery through a window they forgot to look out of. Margaret had spent the better part of her existence living in 2 places simultaneously. There was the version of the past she had carefully curated in her memory, the good years before things went wrong, the choices she could have made differently, the roads not taken that she had turned into something close to mythology. And there was the imagined future, the retirement that would finally feel peaceful, the reconciliation with her daughter that was always just around the corner, the version of herself that she would one day become when circumstances finally aligned. Between those 2 poles, the present moment had very little room to exist. What makes Margaret's story so remarkable is not just what happened to her in that hospital room. It is everything that led her there. Because when you trace the thread of her life backward, you begin to see a pattern that is as familiar as it is heartbreaking. A pattern that plays out in homes and offices and quiet kitchens all over the world. A pattern built out of something that psychologists have long identified as one of the most painful and persistent features of the human mind, the inability to simply be where you are. Margaret was born in a small town in the American Midwest in 1957, the 3rd of 5 children in a household where the unspoken rule was that you kept moving. Her father worked long hours at a factory. Her mother managed the household with a kind of brisk efficiency that left little room for stillness. Sitting quietly and reflecting was not something anyone in the family did. You got through the day, and then you got through the next one. Feelings were not processed. They were stored, like old furniture in a basement, accumulating dust in rooms nobody visited. She fell in love for the first time at 17. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of person who made you feel seen in a way that you had not known you were missing. They were together for 3 years before she ended things, convinced that there was more waiting for her somewhere else. It was a decision she would revisit in her mind for the next 50 years. Not because Daniel was the great love of her life, but because the ending became the first major entry in the archive of regret she would spend decades building. She told herself she had made the wrong choice. She told herself so many times that she began to believe the story completely. The science of regret is far more complex than most people appreciate. Researchers studying the psychology of regret, including work conducted at institutions like Miami University in Ohio, have found that regret is among the most commonly experienced negative emotions in everyday human life. But what makes regret so consuming is not the regret itself. It is the rumination that accompanies it. Rumination is the act of returning to the same painful thought again and again without any new insight or resolution. It is chewing on something without digesting it. And for Margaret, Daniel was just the beginning. She married at 24. Her husband, Robert, was a kind and steady man who loved her in a way that she often described as reliable. They built a life together. They had children. They bought a house with a garden she never quite got around to tending. Robert was present in the way that Margaret was not. He noticed things. He would stop on a walk to point out the specific color of the sky at dusk. He would sit with a cup of coffee in the morning and simply be with the morning. Margaret watched him do these things and could not understand how he managed it. Her mind was always somewhere else. There is a concept in psychology and positive well-being research that describes what Margaret was experiencing. It is the idea that the present moment is the only place where life is actually occurring, and that every form of emotional suffering, whether anxiety about the future or grief about the past, is in some sense a departure from that singular point of reality. Anxiety lives in the future. Regret lives in the past. And the present, unguarded and unnarrated, can feel almost unbearably exposed. For someone who had spent a lifetime managing her interior world through storytelling and memory and projection, the simple act of being present felt like standing in a field with no shelter. Robert passed away when Margaret was 52. It was sudden. A heart condition they had known about but not taken seriously enough. One morning he was there, and by afternoon he was gone. And with him went every anchor Margaret had unconsciously attached to the present moment. Because while she had not always been emotionally available in their marriage, she had at least been tethered to the daily rhythm of his presence, the structure of his routines, the sound of him moving through the house. When he died, that structure collapsed entirely, and Margaret was left inside a grief so profound it reorganized everything she thought she knew about herself. Grief, when it arrives in that particular magnitude, has a way of doing something unusual to time. People who have experienced significant loss often report that the past and the present collapse into each other. A song on the radio becomes a doorway into a moment 20 years gone. A smell in a grocery store can reach through the years and pull you so completely into a memory that the actual aisle you are standing in ceases to feel real. Margaret lived in this collapsed timeline for years after Robert's death. She was technically present in her daily life, continuing to teach, continuing to manage the household. But she was not there in any meaningful sense. She was conducting her existence from a great distance. Her daughter, Claire, noticed. The relationship between Margaret and Claire had always been layered with the particular complexity that exists between mothers and daughters who are similar in ways neither is fully willing to acknowledge. Claire had inherited her mother's tendency to live everywhere except the present. She had also inherited her mother's difficulty saying the things that most needed saying. For years the two of them maintained a relationship that was cordial and responsible, and almost entirely surface level. There were phone calls on birthdays. There were visits at the holidays. But the real conversations, the ones about what was actually happening beneath the surface of their lives, those did not happen. What Margaret did not know during those years, and what Claire had never found the words to share, was that Claire was struggling profoundly. She had been dealing with anxiety that had spiraled in her 30s into something that limited her life in significant ways. She had spent years in and out of therapy, trying to understand why she felt so disconnected from her own experience. Her therapists had often pointed back to her childhood, to the particular atmosphere of emotional absence that had characterized the home she grew up in. Not a home without love, a home without presence. And for a long time, Claire had blamed her mother for that absence without ever telling her so. The weight of unspoken things between parents and children is a subject that researchers and therapists have written about extensively. The American Psychological Association and numerous independent mental health researchers have documented how emotional distance in parent-child relationships, particularly the kind rooted in emotional unavailability rather than overt conflict, can create lasting patterns in children's attachment styles, their ability to regulate emotions, and their capacity to form and sustain intimate relationships. Claire carried all of this without Margaret ever knowing the depth of it. And Margaret, meanwhile, carried her own version of the story, equally incomplete. The moment that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday in October, which is to say it arrived on the most ordinary possible kind of day. Margaret was 67 years old. She had been retired for 3 years. She had settled into a kind of functional solitude, managing her days with the same efficient minimalism her mother had once modeled for her. She still spent a great deal of time in the past. She still ran through the old regrets, Daniel, Robert, the years of distance with Claire, with the same reflexive consistency of someone who has never found a different way to spend a quiet evening. Her inner world was organized almost entirely around what had already happened and what could never be changed. Claire called on that Tuesday, and something in her voice was different. She was not calling to chat. She had been diagnosed 2 weeks earlier with a condition that the doctors were still working to fully understand, and she needed surgery. It was not immediately life-threatening, but it was serious. And what Claire said next was the thing that stopped Margaret's heart in a way it had not been stopped since Robert died. Claire said that if something happened during the surgery, she needed her mother to know that she had spent years angry at her, and that she did not want that anger to be the last uncomplicated thing between them. She said she loved her. She said she was sorry it had taken a health scare to make her say so. Margaret did not respond immediately. She stood in her kitchen, phone in hand, and felt something she had not felt in what seemed like forever. She felt the full weight of the present moment. Not a memory. Not a projection. The actual, irreducible now. The tile floor beneath her feet. The light coming through the window over the sink. Her daughter's voice on the other end of the line, real and vulnerable and present in a way that cracked something open in Margaret that she had not known was closed. She drove 4 hours to be with Claire before the surgery. She sat in that hospital room, holding her daughter's hand, and something extraordinary happened. The interior monologue that had been running in Margaret's mind for 6 decades quieted. The archive of regret, the revised history, the imagined futures, all of it receded. And what remained was simply the two of them, in a room, breathing together. Margaret wept in a way she had not permitted herself to weep since Robert's funeral. She told Claire things she had not known she was carrying. Claire told her mother things that Margaret had not known she needed to hear. And in that compressed, luminous, terrifying space of true presence, something between them shifted fundamentally. The surgery went well. Claire recovered. But what did not recover, what was not permitted to reassemble itself, was the emotional distance that had characterized their relationship for decades. Because something had been seen. Something had been said. And now that it had been spoken, it could not be taken back or covered over or managed from a safe distance. Margaret and Claire had been present with each other, genuinely and completely present, for the first time in their shared lives. And neither of them was willing to go back to the way things had been before. In the months that followed, Margaret began the process of learning something she had never been taught. She began learning how to actually inhabit her own life. It did not happen all at once. She started attending a mindfulness-based group that her doctor had recommended, a program rooted in the kind of evidence-based work that researchers like Jon Kabat-Zinn had pioneered at the University of Massachusetts Medical School beginning in the late 1970s. The program was simple. It was not mystical. It asked participants to pay attention to what was actually happening in the present moment, not to evaluate it or narrate it or compare it to something else, but simply to notice it. For Margaret, this was among the most difficult things she had ever attempted. The habit of the wandering mind is not easily broken. Research consistently shows that chronic rumination, the pattern of returning to the same unresolved thoughts repeatedly, is deeply linked to depression and anxiety, not merely as a symptom of those conditions, but as a mechanism that actively sustains and intensifies them. The brain, when left without deliberate redirection, tends to default to its most well-worn tracks. And for someone like Margaret, those tracks had been carved deep over 7 decades. Learning to stay in the present moment was, in the most literal neurological sense, the work of building new ones. She made a habit of sitting with her morning coffee in silence, not scrolling, not planning, not reviewing, just sitting. She began taking walks without earphones, paying attention to the specific quality of the light on a given morning, the sounds of the neighborhood waking up, the physical sensation of her feet on the ground. She started calling Claire more often, and the calls were different now. They were not managed performances of connection. They were actual conversations between two people who had agreed, without using those exact words, to stop pretending that surface was enough. She also began doing something she had always resisted, which was letting herself feel the things she had spent a lifetime filing away. The grief over Robert. The grief over the years of distance with Claire. The grief over the version of herself she had always believed was waiting just around the corner of some better set of circumstances. Grief, she was learning, does not actually get smaller when you avoid it. It gets denser. It compresses itself into something harder and more obstructive. When you are willing to feel it fully, it moves. It does not disappear. But it changes shape, the way that ice becomes water when warmth is finally applied to it. There is a concept that psychologists and therapists who work with grief and loss often return to, and it is the idea that healing after loss is not about moving on from what was lost. It is about expanding the capacity to carry what happened while still choosing to live fully in the present. Margaret had spent 15 years after Robert's death trying to move on, which for her had meant not feeling the loss, filing it away with the other things in the basement. What she was learning now, at 67, was that the invitation was not to move on but to move through. And what waited on the other side of that passage was not forgetfulness. It was presence. There are practical steps you can take if Margaret's story resonates with you, because the patterns she experienced are not hers alone. If you find yourself spending significant mental energy replaying past events without reaching any new understanding, consider whether you are ruminating rather than reflecting. Reflection moves. It extracts meaning and generates forward motion. Rumination circles. It returns to the same point again and again, and asks the same questions that have no new answers. Noticing the difference is the beginning of changing the pattern. Consider carving out even 5 minutes each morning to simply be without an agenda, without your phone, without a plan, without narration. Just let the morning exist around you and practice noticing it. If there is someone in your life with whom you have allowed emotional distance to accumulate, do not wait for a hospital room to create the urgency to speak. The conversation that feels too heavy to have today will not become lighter by being postponed. It will become more freighted, more loaded with the weight of all the time that has passed. The version of Margaret who sat in that hospital room had access to the same love she had always carried for her daughter. What changed was not the love. What changed was her willingness to be present with it, to let it exist out loud, in the actual moment, without management or delay. Margaret turned 68 recently. She and Claire spent the birthday together. They planted a garden, which Margaret had never managed to get around to during the decades she lived in the house with Robert. She does not tend it with any particular expertise. The plants are uneven and somewhat chaotic and absolutely alive. She told Claire that she thinks of the garden the way she now tries to think of each day, not as something to be controlled or perfected or preserved, but as something to be in fully and without reservation, for as long as it lasts. The most important thing she says she has learned, after 67 years and one goodbye that nearly did not happen in time, is this: the life you are living right now is the only one that is actually occurring. The past is a story you are telling. The future is a story you have not yet written. The present is the only place where any of it is real. And learning to be there, truly and fully there, is the most meaningful work a human being can do. If this story touched something in you, there is something important you can do right now. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone you have been meaning to call. Someone you have been meaning to tell something true. Let this be the nudge that makes today the day you actually do it. And if you are finding value in stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel so that you never miss what comes next. There are more stories like Margaret's waiting to be told, and the next one might be the one that changes something for you.